So we're going to focus on the lead, which is the opening of your story. It's obviously the most important part of your story, so that's why we're going to take a closer look at that and just focus on that for right now before we really get into writing the entire story. I'll just give you some quick ideas of what features there are to a lead. They're very short. If you're talking about a news lead, most of the time you'll see them around 25 to 35 words in length. Very concise, so you should review your writing and make sure you're saying things in the fewest words possible. And you want to frame the story. The opening of the story should frame the entire story. So think of it as, say, if you're building a house, you would first put the frame up. You wouldn't start building the interior before you had framed the house. It's the same thing with the story. You have to really get a sense of what the story is all about. You don't want to over sensationalize a story. You want to be fair and accurate. And it should somehow entice the reader into wanting to go on. So that's a key part of it as well. And think of what about the story is interesting. What makes the story interesting? So make that kind of the lead of the story. And you want to, before you start writing, think about, what's the strongest news angle? Sometimes you'll hear the expression that you bury the lead. You don't want to have the most important part of the story halfway through the story or towards the end. It should be right up at top. One way to think about it, if you thought of a movie that was shot in New York, say, the opening shot might be this kind of wide shot overlooking the cityscape. The next shot might be a close-up maybe of a city street. Then you might see a car pull up and then some people getting out. Then you would focus more on those individual people, and then you might get even closer and start hearing what they're saying. So a story structure kind of moves that way, and the lead is kind of the big overview first shot that kind of sets the whole thing up. You think of telling a story backwards. This is a very hard idea for a lot of beginning journalism students to understand, but in journalism you give away the whole point of the story right in the opening. You don't wait till the end or some big conclusion. You have to tell people right away. If the butler did it and was guilty of murder, you tell people right in the first paragraph, right in the opening. So think of telling the story backwards. And you can do this with any movie, but if I said describe the plot of the movie The Wizard of Oz, and you might want to try this now, pause the movie and try and do that in 25 to 35 words, which is a summary of that, and tell the whole story. Don't leave anything out that's important. That's a good exercise. You can do it with any movie, of course, that you know, or any book, or and when you start thinking along those lines, you'll sort of understand the importance of the lead and how that type of storytelling is very important in journalism. An old idea, but still useful to think about, is the inverted pyramid, where if you look at it and the most important information is at the top, so that's going to be the lead. Then when we get into later writing the body of the story, you'll have more details, quotes, background support. So details, very specific information, you don't want to have in the lead. You want to think more of summary. So specific addresses or specific names, unless they're very important to a story, exact times or things like that, you would probably leave out. Save that for the body of the story. And then as you go through the story, lesser and lesser information, less information that's important, that's where that would go towards the end of a story. Sometimes I think people think journalism is all about the 5 W's, but not necessarily true. You would maybe have who, what, why, when, where in a lead, but it really depends. Sometimes the who is very important, sometimes what. Most often why is more key. Why and what seem to be very important. So you don't have to necessarily think of, I got to get the 5 W's into my lead, but think of, what's most important about a story and how can I sum up that story in an opening paragraph. The two types of leads that we're going to talk about are summary leads, which are leads in which you take the point of a story and sum it up in about 25 to 35 words. Summary lead, hard news lead, those are the two names probably most associated with that type of lead. You see that most often in breaking news stories, but more often people are also looking at the feature structure, which is also called a feature lead or a delayed lead. So in that, you don't tell people in the first graph what the story is about. Instead, you delay that information, and you build up a little storytelling in the first few graphs. It can be very creative. Sometimes it's a description. Sometimes maybe it's an anecdote. Any way you can think of. And then you don't want to wait too long. You wait about 3 to 5 paragraphs into a story. Then you will sum up the point of the story as you transition from that opening into a paragraph called the nut graph. So those are the feature leads. Examples of feature leads, you could have some kind of description, maybe a narrative, a storytelling, anecdote. You can contrast something and tell people, once this area used to be this way, now it's another way, and that's the point of the story. Sometimes people ask a question in the lead, and then of course the nut graph would be the answer to that question. You can directly address the reader. Those are called U leads. You can create a little suspense or mystery, but eventually you do have to get to a nut graph where you sum up the whole point of the story. You can find countless examples of these in newspapers and news sites, so I would start reading stories and looking at it to see what's a hard news lead, what's a feature lead. Here is an example of a typical hard news lead. You see that on the left side of this slide. A major earthquake. You see that you have some big overview information. You know it took place in Central America. You know how many people died, but you don't have a lot of specifics yet. And you start to see on the right side, as you go through the story, some more specific information about the earthquake, where it was centered, sort of more exact locations. That's the supporting detailed information that goes in the body of the story. A feature lead here, we have the first 4 graphs of a story on the left, which is more of an anecdote. It doesn't tell you yet what the story is about. You just hear about one teacher's experience in a classroom, a substitute teacher's experience, and it kind of sets the story up nicely. And then in the 5th graph, which is the first graph on the right side of the slide, that is more the beginning of a transition to a nut graph. And looks like the 6th graph, which begins, but there is help, training seminars, that graph is really the whole point of the story. So that would be the nut graph. So that's the example of the structure of the feature lead. So what I want you to get out of this unit is to think about those two types of leads and learning how to write them.